Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my personal podcast tour of the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe. Friday the 13th, 1980. I'm not the biggest fan of the Friday the 13th franchise, but I've always had an unusual personal connection to it. I was actually born on a Friday the 13th. But more relevantly, back in the summer of 1989, I was a camp counselor at the idyllic Camp Starlight in New York State. It had the lake and boating docks like the forbidding Camp Crystal Lake of the movie series, vibrant young counselors in the bloom of youth, and even younger kids for us to protect. So there's a certain nostalgic fondness for these films that I can't resist. However, I like to think I'm a fierce but fair critic of most of the franchise. By the time I underwent the American summer camp experience, Friday the 13th had just ended its 8th incarnation with the appalling Jason Goes to Manhattan, and was about to literally go to hell. But we need to go back, before Mrs. Voorhees' pride and joy grew to marauding adulthood. Pick up that hockey mask, and let me take you on a journey through the 80s. The good, the bad, and the very ugly. Producer-director Sean S. Cunningham reached a transformational turning point in his life actually at the turn of the 70s. Before the age of 30, he had already conquered Broadway's Great White Way as a director and wanted to cross over into cinema. Descended from first-generation Irish, he demonstrated the work ethic that Lin-Manuel Miranda referred to in Hamilton. Immigrants, we get the job done. He benefited from the can-do spirit best exemplified by those who, as he put it, didn't know enough to be intimidated. He was unfazed by having to slog through New York's exploitation scene in the 70s. He said, "All you need in order to be a film producer is a telephone and some stationery." His infectious enthusiasm attracted a core group of talents who would rise with him in the industry and testify to his loyalty. Among them were fellow filmmaker Wes Craven, whose The Last House on the Left he would produce, as I covered in episode 196, and Harry Manfredini, composer of Friday the 13th's hugely iconic soundtrack. In the excellent volume Crystal Lake Memories, Cunningham recounted that his first feature film, The Art of Marriage, was a hardcore porn film that avoided censure by being what they called a white coater, presented as a faux educational film introduced by an equally fictitious medical expert, which then served to excuse the XXX material that followed. Cunningham was ambitious enough to promote the film by telephoning New York movie theaters himself and cutting an exhibition deal. From a budget of $3,500, he cleared $100,000 in profit from just one venue. Gaining in confidence and contacts, Cunningham graduated to the better production values of a softcore film called Together in 1971, starring a young Marilyn Chambers, who of course would feature memorably in David Cronenberg's second horror feature later in the decade. It was here that he employed Wes Craven as assistant editor on their virtually sleepless 2-week marathon of assembling Together for release. At the time, it proved a relatively healthy distraction for Craven. He had quit his job as a humanities professor to try his own luck in New York, and also needed to recover from a debilitating failed marriage. So what did he have to lose? Recalling their nightmare schedule of post-production, Craven said, "We really became war buddies at the end of that process." The trenches analogy was controversially used as a subtextual impetus for the notorious horror revenge movie that the two would partner on straight after. Together had rewarded them with such a huge suburban hit, the year before Deep Throat turned porn into a fashionable pop culture happening, that Cunningham was given $90,000 and a brief to make a scary movie. He produced and Craven directed Last House on the Left, written by Victor Miller, which, for all its faults, launched them into careers as name horrormeisters. Both men in later years regarded the film and its legacy as what Cunningham admitted was a double-edged sword, and for Craven represented a period of societal taboo-breaking that he confessed gets very old very fast. Nonetheless, the film's visceral mayhem put them on the movie industry's radar. While Craven went on to cement his reputation with The Hills Have Eyes, which I covered in episode 197, Cunningham struggled to find his footing for a while. helming the Bad News Bears ripoff Here Come the Tigers and the family-friendly Manny's Orphans, both written by Last House writer Victor Miller. For his directorial debut in the horror genre, Cunningham then looked to the startling success of John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978 for how to create a low-budget horror movie that might similarly catch fire with young, thrill-seeker audiences. Its template of restrictions on budget, locations, and cast, opting for unknown actors, and a simplicity of premise, meant that its break-even point for profit was much lower than a major studio release. Victor Miller spent a week just trying to come up with a physical setting where his young protagonists could be placed in jeopardy, until he recalled his big brother's stories of being away at summer camp. Bingo! A perfect location that's as sealed off and focused as the world of a sitcom. Set it before the camp opens, and you bypass any censorship concerns about children in peril. What Miller called Long Night at Camp Blood for his first drafts soon became Friday the 13th, when Cunningham recalled a short list of names he once invented for movies he thought could sell themselves. He must have been as surprised as Carpenter to discover that the chosen date on which to hang his own horror conceit had also never been used before. According to Wikipedia, the fear of this date has multiple possible origins across differing cultures. 13 was the total number of Christ's disciples plus himself at the Last Supper. To the Greeks, the fear of Friday the 13th is paraskevidekatriaphobia, derived from the Greek paraskevi, meaning Friday, and dekatreis, 13. In the summer of 1979, Cunningham took a bold step of pre-promotion worthy of Israeli producers Golan and Globus when he took out a memorable advert in Variety featuring the famous title smashing through a window. The poster trumpeted, "The most terrifying film ever made, available December 1979. The impact was so effective that international distributors beat a path to his door, wanting in on this mouth-watering concept, not knowing it wasn't even ready for production. In the 1980s, Golan and Globus developed this tactic into a hugely successful business model, pre-selling their movies via multiple foreign distributors based on nothing but a poster, so that their films turned a profit before they even began shooting. Sean Cunningham secured a budget of $500,000 from his Boston investor Phil Scuderi. Like many career turning points, though, it almost didn't happen. Scuderi's tough terms initially caused Cunningham to refuse. After a sleepless night, he bit the machete and finally agreed to them. Just as well. If he'd resisted another 20 minutes the next morning, Scuderi would have plowed the investment into a shopping center. Friday the 13th was now off and running. Such was Cunningham's still raw process as a director that he had never used a professional casting director before. Fortunately, he enlisted Barry Moss and Julie Hughes. Amongst some winning and wholesome choices, they landed him future A-list talent Kevin Bacon, fresh from his snotty but hilarious fraternity pledge in National Lampoon's Animal House. He had an unpretentious jobbing actor's approach to the work and simply took the role in his stride. One casting choice that Cunningham always remained unsure about, surprisingly, was fan favorite Walt Gorney as the town oddball Crazy Ralph. The director wanted Ralph to misdirect the audience into suspecting him as a potential murderer, and he felt that Gorney perhaps wasn't quite as sinister as he'd wanted. Nevertheless, watching Paramount's first Friday the 13th again after nearly 40 years, it holds up pretty well. The pace is tight, and the performances from the mostly very young cast of Camp Crystal Lake's counselors are engaging. Their late 70s innocence is plausible without being too cute, aside from intended camp cook Annie, Robbie Morgan, who is so naive that she throws her rucksack into the back of a flagged-down Jeep without even vetting the driver. This is a cleverly conceived scene, actually, as it disguises the driver's identity by being shot subjectively from their point of view. Spoiler alert? Well, since the film has been out for over 40 years, maybe I can dispense with the non-binary gender, as horror fans will almost all know the killer is ultimately female. Another smart plot decision noticed from this re-viewing is that for the first 2 acts, no impending victim finds the dead body of a previous one, disabling them from knowing enough to simply flee the camp in terror. Not that this would really help, mind you, since it's a staple commandment in the genre that "thou shalt disregard common sense and unwisely go toward whatever maketh dubious noises." The kills are well executed by much-loved FX gore supremo Tom Savini. Inevitably, though, time has taken the edge off their shock value, even in this uncut US DVD version. The casting of Betsy Palmer as Mrs. Voorhees in the third act proved a bonus. She was a beguilingly wholesome actress whose career spanned over 50 years, including 12 as a panelist on the TV game show I've Got a Secret, an ironically prescient title since part of this film's fun hinges on her hidden identity as the real serial killer. She initially shows a disarming, protective motherliness in front of final girl Alice, Adrienne King, before crumbling into a deliciously batshit insanity as the memory of how her son Jason was tragically neglected by counselors back in 1958 overcomes her poise. The resulting catfight climax on the shore is shoddily staged. The two ladies wrestle like a couple of schoolgirls squabbling in a sandpit, but Savini and Cunningham give us a lovingly slow-mode machete decapitation by Alice. The handsome string-centric music score by Harry Manfredini helps to differentiate the overall movie's production values from the slasher herd as being a major studio release, albeit with some emphatic nods towards Bernard Herrmann's Psycho score. His own compositions are attractive, and the last one does much to augment the power of the contentious final horror set-piece. Taking its cue, as it were, from the erupting hand closer of Brian De Palma's Carrie in 1976, we are sold an idyllic seeming end as a sleepy Alice drifts on the lake in a canoe. As the sheriff's men arrive at the lakeside, the camera slowly pushes in amid a Manfredini romantic swell. All is well at last. Until a deformed Jason bursts up from the water and pulls Alice to a watery grave. It still hits the spot as a jump shock, and would have been all the more powerful if Cunningham had then cut to black and then the credits right there. But no, maddeningly, he sabotages its power by then cutting to Alice in a hospital bed epilogue, quizzing the cops about the mysterious boy whom they never saw when retrieving her from the lake. What also doesn't help is that King's perplexity is her least convincing acting scene. A bigger nitpicking issue, however, the type that horror fans like myself love to debate, centers around Voorhees Jr. appearing at all. As someone points out in Crystal Lake Memories, if that was Jason, where the hell has he been for 20 years? And why hasn't anyone spotted him before now? I had questions of my own. Why didn't he carry out his own vendetta the rest of the time instead of his mum? And what did he live on for 2 decades? Plankton, while swimming about undetected like the creature from the Black Lagoon? These questions naturally were never answered, as a Friday the 13th franchise thus developed from this film's huge success to cover the next 29 years. Its runaway success surprised everyone, not least its director. A share of the credit for this can be given to Paramount head Frank Mancuso Sr., who threw his weight behind the kind of mass-marketing campaign usually reserved only for major tentpole releases, yet targeted very deliberately and shrewdly at the teen demographic. The studio was to be richly rewarded. Cunningham himself was hoping for maybe $6 or $7 million at the box office, so he could begin to make money. The wide release and stellar word of mouth gave Friday the 13th an extended life well beyond expectations, rising to a final tally of $39.7 million, beating its nearest rival studio's genre offerings The Shining and Dress to Kill. The sequels continually tried to tinker with the source movie's playbook and timeline. What this original and intermittent sequels proved is that, like any movie property, it works only when treating the audience with a little respect in choosing screenwriters and directors. All too often, behind the scenes, the filmmakers behaved like trustafarians who inherited a sausage factory, as we shall see. Stay tuned. Thanks for listening. If you like what you hear, please don't forget to hit subscribe.